Salams, peace, blessings. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to our event. Hold on a second, my screen, there we go. Welcome to our event, They Can't Watch Our Dreams, Muslim Surveillance and Bodily Autonomy. I'm your host and I'll be your moderator for today. My name is Shenaaz Janmohamed. I go by she and they pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of Queer Crescent. We are excited to share with you over the next hour and a half our collective thinking and dreaming of what this political moment asks of us as people committed to the liberation and freedom of all peoples. And towards that end, I want to begin by honoring and acknowledging that I am tuning in from the territory of the Huichin, the original landscape of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, also known as the Bay Area. And if you're also with me in the Bay Area, I encourage you to support the work of Sagorete and contribute to Shumi. Shumi is the Chochenyo word for gift, like zakat, I guess we could think about it in that way. And this is a way for non-Indigenous peoples to participate in the rematriation of land to Indigenous people. And if you're outside of the Bay, I encourage you to find local Native organizations to support. It's important to start this way because as LGBTQI plus Muslims, we understand the impacts of colonization, how it has shaped and narrowed our cultures, how it threatens our relationship to land, creates and maintains false borders, both internally with cis hetero white supremacist and Christian hegemonic constructs, and in the creation and maintenance of nation states. Therefore, as US-based Muslims, we must connect and engage in solidarity with our Native siblings. Acknowledging and contributing to Shumi, the land tax, rematriating the land to Native peoples, are examples and ways to remind us to root in place and to grapple with the multiplicity of our identities, whether we are dispossessed, descendants of those that were brought here in captivity as enslaved folks, and or settlers on this land. So I also want to appreciate all the folks that have made this event possible, you all for tuning in and taking the time to be here, and the Queer Crescent team, the folks that are unseen in this event who are holding this down for us. Dalia Magoob and Amara Ahmed are helping on the tech and the Zoom, and so I'm very grateful for the two of you. A little bit about our work before I turn to our panelists. So Queer Crescent imagines futures where LGBTQI plus Muslims are building possibilities towards collective liberation. Our work is shaped by building possibilities toward, our work is shaped by resisting gendered violence through cultural organizing, base building, and defining Muslimness as an expansive and racialized identity. Starting with the Safer Space community drop-in space in response to the Muslim and African travel ban in 2017, we continue to build out our programs to meet the needs of the most marginal Muslims. At the beginning of the pandemic, for example, in April of 2020, we partnered with Masjid Arabia and redistributed $65,000 back to our communities in the form of mutual aid. And many of the recipients were either formerly or are at the time incarcerated. And today we kick off a week of action for bodily autonomy as a response to this moment of increased threats to safety and our bodies, from emboldened white supremacists having unchecked access to guns or accountability. And last month on May 2nd, there was a draft opinion piece by Justice Alito that was leaked saying that the Supreme Court was planning to vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, the law that protects access to abortion. This was anticipated, as well as the ways that community will continue. What's anticipated is the ways that communities will be continued to be criminalized for accessing reproductive health care. Simultaneously, for the last 5 years, we've seen a steady increase in assaults on trans communities with ongoing legislation restricting movement, access to basic needs such as bathrooms, banning from sports participation, and codifying a violently limiting notion of gender. And so it's these intersecting moments that we come together to have this discussion. Queer Crescent is deeply shaped by Black feminist feminisms and Black queer feminisms who offer deep wisdom and possibility on what a just world and communities of care ought to look like. Reproductive justice leader Sister Song has helped us to understand that bodily autonomy is about living with dignity and safety, from housing to jobs, clean water, being in right relationship to the land and the environment, and of course, reproductive health care, from abortion, access to gender-affirming healthcare, parenting support, childcare, and more. For Queer Crescent, we also see reproductive justice as bodily autonomy, and that as LGBTQI Muslims, we are an embodiment of bodily autonomy as we self-determine what it means to be Muslim. For us, bodily autonomy means access, it means safety to access, vision, and embody the gender, healthcare, and choices about our bodies without state or religious intervention. And yet the state continues to intervene. As Muslim communities, we live through the pervasive legacies of surveillance. And to this end, I will stop talking and turn to my esteemed panelists, my colleagues and comrades, to further discuss this moment and collectively dream of ways to keep our communities safer. So I'll start by introducing folks, and I feel so delighted that you all are here in this fight with us. I'll start by introducing Vanessa Taylor, is a Philadelphia-based writer and Afrofuturist. She is the curator of NAZAR, and if you aren't subscribed to the Substack, get on it. It's really good stuff. Good in the sense of like heartbreak and like, ugh. Okay, she's the curator of NAZAR, an independent journalism project on surveillance, and the founding editor-in-chief of The Drinking Gourd, a Black Muslim literary magazine. We also have Rafa Kidvai, who is the Legal Defense Fund Director at If, When, How, as well as a Queer Crescent board member, and who has deeply shaped the organization's Queer Crescent's orientation towards reproductive justice and really seeing our work as a struggle for bodily autonomy. Rafa was a public defender at the Legal Aid Society Brooklyn Criminal Defense Practice, was a legal fellow at Court Watch New York City, and director of Immigrant Justice, Paul Rappaport Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. Rafa's work and activism has focused on queer and trans liberation, supporting survivors of intimate partner violence, economic justice, family defense, immigrant justice, and prison abolition. Rafa attended CUNY School of Law and Hampshire College. And finally, Mirna Haider is a queer Muslim refugee from Lebanon. Most recently, Mirna worked as a public defender at the Legal Aid Society Parole Revocation Defense Unit, representing people accused of parole violations at Rikers Island. They also served as the steering committee member of Masjid, the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity, one of our North Star organizations as queer Muslims, amongst a ton of other organizing in queer Muslim spaces. Mirna also attended CUNY Law, where they were part of the Defender Clinic and the Clear, a CUNY clinic offering free legal representation and support to primarily Muslim communities who are targeted by the government under the guise of the national security and quote unquote counterterrorism. They are a proud mama of twins, Rumi and Noah. So we're really delighted for you all to share your time and space with us today. Mirna, let's start with you.
Hi, salam everyone. My name is Mirna Haider. I go by they and she. And thank you for this intro. I'm very emotional, but it's okay. It's good. Our work is emotional, and I think we should own up to that emotional piece of our work, emotional labor. So with that being said, I do want to clarify that I am no longer a refugee. I think it's important to let people know that I have transitioned into an American citizen, and I think that's important to share as I continue this conversation. So, I kept thinking about what I want to share with people. There's a lot to share, not enough time. And, I'd like to also hear from people, their questions, etc. So I thought to tell you a few things that I have shared. So disclaimer, what I'm going to be sharing with you is purely my own experience working in this and also being subject to some of those laws and policies that have impacted me as a queer Muslim immigrant who has applied for asylum and had to, and was on a watch list. And that's why my immigration benefits got denied and delayed for about a decade. So sharing that, I think, is important to frame why I do the work I do today and why collectively as queer Muslims, it's important for us to work towards a collective liberation that is not just on the defense, but more actually uprooting and working towards abolition, inshallah, as we say within our spaces. So with that being said, I would like us to start with some of the tools of the oppressors that are used currently in surveying our communities and how that same tool that has been developed by the government will continue to be used as the American government and the Supreme Court takes away more rights. And the center of our work right now at RLDF is how do we combat the criminalization of self-managed abortions and protecting people who do fit within that definition and those lived experiences, but not only them, also their family members and the people who quote unquote help them go through that process are also targeted by the criminalization of this. So those tools that are currently used are, I don't want to sound a pessimist, but they have a lot of tools. So let's just break them down. Surveillance is not just about having an informant be at a mosque and taking notes of who's doing what and what we believe in. Surveillance in this day is more like targeting us via our emails, social media platforms, and also our existence on social media, and flagging some of our thoughts or ideologies as considered as under like a threat to the United States. And from there on, they can survey us and prosecute us for either being, part of a quote unquote terrorist or sympathizing with terrorism or also assisting someone. And sorry, please feel free to chat in something that you want clarifications on or flag something that you want me to kind of break down for you or ask it later, that's fine. I will be saying maybe a lot of things that I might assume we know, but is not really general knowledge. So I'm gonna backtrack a little bit more. The tools of the oppressors are many and not just an informant. There are also important tools that we're not talking about, is that law enforcement has developed many task forces. They're working together from different arms of the government to share information and be able to report and prosecute some of us. And for an example of that I've personally worked around and knowing and fighting are the JTTF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And that task force is nothing hidden. They're not trying to hide that collaboration, but if you look them up, they work with different entities all over the states, from police to campus security funded by the state, to medical security funded also by the state, to anybody really who's getting some federal funding and some sort of security personnel, working together to share information on what they think is a threat to the government. And by that, what they do then is really depending on the level of what they have and how much we know as a community, and we can defend ourselves by knowing our rights and enforcing some of those rights that we have, is that they can strip you away from a lot of things, your liberty, freedom, the peace of mind of living, not feeling like they can watch us. And that's why I love the title of this panel, is that it's so empowering to remember that they can't watch our dreams, and they will not ever get to be able to interfere with how we collectively envision our liberation. So the reason why I mentioned JTTF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, is because they are working together to report on us. And that impacts Muslim folks, specifically immigrant folks, more than any other person. And let me now link it to self-managed abortion. I don't know how many people know that the immigration form, if you're applying for any immigration benefit, usually there will be a question or two about, or I mean, there are many questions, but the two questions that I think about and that in my personal opinion will be a problem for folks who also maybe fall within the definition of self-managed abortion and being targeted by the criminalization of doing such a thing, is that any person applying for immigration benefit, they would need to answer a few questions. Some of which are, for example, do you believe in polygamy? Are you in a polygamous relationship? And we understand this to be a critical question, especially I think within queer spaces, and we don't talk about this enough. But actually being able to attend a conference or be part of a poly group online is dangerous today, especially for people who are not part of a, they're not a citizen, or they are part of a, POC community that is, depending on their immigration status, because that could be perceived as someone either lying to the government or not, because denying benefits is all based on a framework that you have lied to the government and that you will then be denied that immigration benefit. The other question is communism. Many of us get invited to protests and invited to meetings and are asked to attend maybe or engage in communist spaces or ideologies. And that is also something our communities have not been talking enough about, and how we keep each other safe within that space is that those attendance or those invitations can impact people differently in our work. And the way I envision the future in how those forms will change, if the Supreme Court emboldens legislators to change some of those forms and laws and kind of codify them into their different, and this is about so basically immigration federal, but also codifying it in local legislation, I predict, and this is a mere prediction, that also abortion will be a question on those forms. Now, some people might say no way, but this is my fear, that in the future, if we continue at this path in the current rate that we are going within the United States, is that we are going to deny immigration benefits more for people who believe in abortion, and also, that's not even mentioning abolition, inshallah, and all of those, ideologies that we inherently believe in to be able to achieve a collective justice and a collective healthy world that we live in, that has no jails, no prisons, no law enforcement, etc. So that's one way I see the government being able to use, how to survey us extra, and how we are going to be, we as in queer Muslim communities and others who are currently looking for immigration benefits, is that mere ideology does impact people. And another thing on that is that in what we are seeing in self-managed abortion is that they're trying to turn people who we trust within our community against each other. And the government has already done that. And they've done that by giving money to nonprofits within different communities. And those fundings are called CVE. I'm sure some of you might have heard of them, but you can also look that up. This is not hidden information. The government, the Department of Homeland Security, I believe that's the entity, the government entity that did it. There's a report on the website to show you their intentions behind it. And they're not hiding the intentions, is that they give money to work within nonprofits, but the requirements of you receiving that money is that you must report national security threats, terrorism, and those are very vague. And this is very dangerous because, for example, as an immigrant, I came to Michigan as a refugee and asylum seeker. The first thing I did is look up an Arab organization in Michigan. And what did I do? I went to that organization to seek some assistance and guidance on how to be able to apply for immigration status and be able to exist as a human being within that space. I didn't know that Access received some of that funding. And that actually is very incredibly dangerous, and we should be talking about it. And so this is a very similar thing that I believe, and Rafa, I'm sure will touch on this in their talk, is that the main tool of the oppressor is turning each other against each other, turning ourselves against each other, and using our vulnerabilities within, whether we need services or money, or whether we need to fear criminalization, that we are forced to report someone or else there will be repercussions, is the main thing that people are using, the government is using to criminalize folks and also deny immigration benefits. Now, the last piece that I will talk about, and I'm happy again to answer any questions, is that at the rate we are going, okay, and this is again focusing on how self-managed abortion is an important piece of our collective liberation, and as a queer Muslim myself and a parent, how this is important for our work, is that we also need to be aware as a community that if we let this happen, and I know maybe some of us feel we don't have an agency in this, but if the Supreme Court does actually deny the very basic protections that people have in their bodily autonomy, and actually other legislations and states start increasingly more criminalizing people, that immigrants are going to be deported more, the immigrants who are Muslim or immigrants who or people of color will be denied their immigration benefits more often than what it is currently. And I say this because what I've been seeing personally in the work is that when you are a person and you are pregnant, whether you know it or not, and whether you are doing an abortion or not, depending where you are geographically, because different states have different laws, if you are even just accused, not even prosecuted, not even charged, I mean, not even, you don't have a sentence, you have not been sentenced with the charges of usually, like, for example, there's felony murder because they're accusing you of killing a child. But I mean, this is me generalizing, and this is not like legal description of what I'm trying to get to, is that if you are accused, okay, of or investigated for a self-managed abortion, and depending what the prosecutor put as charges on your case, if you are an immigrant seeking immigration benefits, that might, and I'm not sure, I didn't do my legal research, that might deny you benefits, because currently, as it stands today, and this is something I know for sure, is that depending on different federal laws and comparing them with local laws, if you are accused of certain felonies, you are by definition being able to be deported by ICE. And so, and I know I'm saying this, and the reason why there's a little bit of hesitation in my voice is that those look differently in different states, and they look differently also for different people with different access to resources. And again, I'm happy to elaborate more or clarify why I have those, why I've made those connections, because of my experience working with Muslim folks who are being surveyed and approached by the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and how, as someone who's vulnerable and seeking help within our community, it's very important for us to talk about refusing money from the government, especially that is directly connected to us reporting on each other, no matter how that reporting looks like, but also to be able to encourage each other to have honest conversations about what it means to have a safer space online, and how does that impact us as we host these conversations in the future, and how does it impact immigrant folks all over the states with different statuses. So yes, they can't watch our dreams, and abolition is the only way to protect ourselves and each other from any of those oppressive tools that they are deploying on us from many different levels, from whether a personal informant walking into a mosque, or having someone on a WhatsApp chat list or an email, or actually working together to deny someone an immigration benefit and detaining them. We are responsible for our ummah together and collectively, and inshallah, until abolition, we have to stop taking a defense. Like if I want anybody to take something with them today, is that we need to uproot the system. We cannot work within the systems, and the oppressors' tools will not liberate us. And we all know this, I'm sure. I think from the faces and the names I'm seeing from the attendees is that we are aware of this. But in practice, we've got to uproot the whole entire system. And so until abolition, inshallah, I personally will not rest. And I hope that all of us can help each other get there, depending on our privileges and a capacity to be able to do so. So with that, I will rest for now, and I'll be happy to continue the conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Mirna. That was incredibly insightful, and also it makes you tremble a little bit, like when you lay out these conditions. But knowing the landscape and the terrain allows us to get in coordination and strategic about how to support each other, to your point of reaching more safety. So I want to invite Vanessa Taylor into the conversation and to talk about your work with NAZAR and the ways that anti-Blackness and Islamophobia function through the surveillance of bodies, and anything you want to contribute to this conversation.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be on this panel event and to discuss surveillance in depth with all of you. So NAZAR is an anti-surveillance newsletter that I launched in May of 2020. And my decision to launch NAZAR came after I've been struggling to get more involved with tech journalism. And during all of that, I noticed a lot of issues with tech coverage within journalism. And most of it is not unique to the beat alone. So for example, it's super white. A lot of tech coverage tends to act as PR for different companies more than it's actually a journalistic coverage, investigation, anything like that. And then even the stories that are a little more critical of the industry, a little more investigative, sometimes they tend to treat communities of color and the things that happen to us in terms of surveillance as warning signs. So it's more like we're cautionary tales of what can happen to everybody else. Then these things that are happening, the surveillance that is happening, be taken seriously because it is wrong and it shouldn't happen to us either. And so when I kind of noticed these issues and how it was shaping technology coverage, I wanted to try to first get a staff job covering technology, or at least pitch and do some freelancing about it. But neither of those really worked out too well. Particularly with freelancing, I think people assume that when you freelance, you have more freedom to cover different stories and all of that, but not really. Because at the end of the day, you still need to get your story approved by one editor from one publication. You need to shop it around, and it's quite exhausting. And so instead of trying to go that route, I ultimately decided that I wanted to have more control over the stories I wanted to write. So not only being able to get those stories out without having to pitch them, but also having complete control over the framework, the narrative, the sources I was going to connect with, how I was going to write the story without having to go through, some major company's legal team, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's kind of brief on NAZAR. And since we've launched, it's done a lot of different coverage. I've had guest writers write about surveillance in relation to parents and children and how parents are kind of encouraged to surveil their kids within that relationship. I've had people write about Guantanamo Bay. I've covered counter-extremism quite extensively. And so my goal with NAZAR is to have not just a perspective from the United States, but more of a global one. And so having guest writers, speaking with authors, speaking with activists and organizers from across the world has helped me a lot with that. Because, none of us can know everything. We all have our own lenses. I'm very much, I'm based on the United States. My ancestors are from the United States. And so that shapes a lot of the coverage that I have. And so it's important to connect with people and sources that can help fill in the gaps of my own knowledge. So with that being said, I'll talk a little more about how anti-Blackness and Islamophobia function in surveillance. So when thinking about surveillance in relation to these two concepts, anti-Blackness and Islamophobia, there's often a lot of focus on watching. As you'll see notions of the panopticon, that's really big in surveillance-related conversations. And I'm not rejecting that focus on watching as a whole. because it can be quite significant. When I think about surveillance in relations to technology, I often think of the human eye as one of the first technologies that was used for surveillance, for maintaining control of populations. And so many technologies that we have are meant to mimic that, like the camera. With that being said, watching is just one part of the picture. There's only one way that surveillance manifests itself. And as technology grows, and it allows for more assiduous, consistent forms of tracking, like looking at your social media usage, the hashtags that people are posting, looking at your text, looking at your location data, all of that, we need to have a focus and understanding of surveillance as a form of social control. And so a good example of this, recently at NAZAR, I spoke with 2 members of the Community Justice Exchange about a recent report on data criminalization. So I'll just read their definition of data criminalization real quick. So it's the creation, archiving, theft, resale, and analysis of data sets that mark certain people as threats and risks based on data culled about them from state and commercial sources. So this report focused largely on immigration, migration, and the use of data criminalization in relation to ICE. But I think it's a concept that can apply to just every population and surveillance as a whole. But when I spoke to them as well, one member of the organization brought up how at a recent Haymaker event, somebody had discussed how the forms of surveillance that we're seeing are ghosts, right? And so they're ghosts that are coming from a different time, but they're the same ghosts as past problems. And that's something I really keep in mind when I think about anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, and the intersections of the two in relation to surveillance. And it's a framework that's also really evident in the work of Simone Brown. And she's a professor who has influenced me a lot when I talk about and I write about surveillance. And if y'all haven't familiarized yourself with her work, I would really recommend it, especially her book, Dark Matters. But so for example, if I'm thinking about surveillance, I'm thinking about it as a continuation of old problems. We might look at biometric identification like facial recognition. And many people are tempted to approach facial recognition as kind of its own singular issue, its own technology that needs to be abolished. And that's correct to an extent. Facial recognition as a whole, I do not think can exist in this world at all, period. Doesn't matter what regulations you have, doesn't matter how good the technology is at seeing Black people, because it's not good at it right now, and all of that. But at the end of the day, facial recognition technology is also, again, a form of biometric identification. And this is just a way of measuring people and their physical characteristics in order to identify them. And one of the earliest forms of biometric identification in the United States was the slave pass. So if you think about that, and you kind of have that as a background whenever you're looking at new technologies as they emerge, you're always going to be able to question them and kind of keep that question in mind. But lastly, because I don't want to talk for too long right now, I focus a lot of my anti-surveillance work on counter-extremism, as I mentioned. And that's just because when I first became, I don't want to say aware of surveillance, I was an organizer in Minneapolis for some time, so I was always kind of aware of it. But when I first saw people really organizing against present surveillance in real time, it was against the Countering Violent Extremism pilot program in Minneapolis. And so that personal history for me has always shaped surveillance coverage. So with that being said, I was speaking to journalist Arun Kanandi for NAZAR, and he brought up speaking about counter-extremism as an extension of counterinsurgency. And so I just want to read a quote from him real quick. But it said, "Counterinsurgency is a doctrine that comes out of colonial wars. And when you're fighting colonial war to colonize a country, you can't just win by force alone. The phrase that people use is you need to win the hearts and minds. What that actually means in practice is surveillance of the whole population." And so again, it goes back to rethinking about surveillance, not just as the watching, not just as FBI vans posted up outside of individual people's homes, individuals, organizations, but social control of an entire population and looking at not only their actions, but as was mentioned earlier, their ideologies and the thoughts that they are working with. And so that explains the presence of counter-extremism, whether that is CVE, whether it is the targeted violence and terrorism prevention, whatever, however they're going to rename it. That explains its presence among movements that threaten the United States. So a good example of that is DHS categorizing abortion-related violent extremists as people that they need to watch out for. And that includes not only pro-life, but also people who are pro-abortion. And then as well, I think it helps us note the similarities that counter-extremism's rollout in the United States has to counterinsurgency programs like COINTELPRO. And so when COINTELPRO was around, it aimed to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize radical organizing in the United States. And not too long ago, I read an article by the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, in which they talked about the rise of the nonprofit industrial complex and the role that it plays in counterinsurgency today. I just want to read a short quote from them as well. They talked about how, in terms of COINTELPRO, in terms of counterinsurgency and counter-extremism, police don't have to go through quite the same lengths because, quote, instead, police today simply collaborate with reform professionals hired as consultants or prop up community advisory boards, community policing, and community outreach initiatives designed to cultivate buy-in for police violence. And so this is central to counter-extremism and CVE within the United States, because when people talk about CVE, they will often focus on how police receive funding, law enforcement receive funding, but they are not the only people who receive funding. So for example, I'm working on an article where I talk about how in 2021, the Biden administration gave CVE or TVTP funding to media organizations, to universities for their research, to social services, to all of that. So yeah, again, when I think about surveillance, I think about it in relation to anti-Blackness and Islamophobia, that whole reframing of not just focusing on the eye, not just focusing on the literal act of watching, but really thinking about it as social control, as a way to oppress people, as a way to control what they are thinking about before we even think about what they're doing is really important. I think really fundamental to anti-surveillance organizing moving forward.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Just like the insidiousness, you know, and just thinking of the connection of what Mirna was sharing and now what you're sharing in terms of just the control of bodies. And, you know, I think that was a big reason why we wanted to have this week of action, but certainly while this moment felt important to really talk about bodily autonomy for Muslim folks. And I appreciate the way we're rooting in the histories and the ongoing anti-Blackness and the way the body's control of bodies is a tool of anti-Blackness. And Mirna, you were sharing about the ways in which migrants and immigrant folks are kind of under that same kind of logic of anti-Blackness and who belongs, how then immigrant folks and migrant folks get caught in the system as well. So I want to invite Rafa into the conversation, my dear Rafa, to link what folks have already shared, what Vanessa and Mirna have shared, and to bring in this piece around gender. And specifically reproductive justice as an LGBTQI+ liberation issue, and how queer and trans bodies are being surveilled. So I'll turn to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Vanessa and Mirna, for your brilliance. I'm sorry in advance for my scratchy throat. I have so many things to say about surveillance and Muslims and body autonomy and immigration and the family wealth regulation system and the criminal system and the regulation of trans bodies. And so I won't get to it all, obviously, but a couple of things. So first of all, I think Muslims have a lot of information about surveillance. I think we are experts in not only being surveilled, but a culture of surveillance. And I fundamentally think that it's important for us to be rooting our trans justice work and our repro justice work in Muslim spaces, because I think that this is not a community that is surprised by the presence of surveillance, right? We are aware of the presence of surveillance. We have been surveilled. We are also not surprised by the question of the issue of being seen as suspicious, and specifically depending on the kind of Muslim you are. So if you're a Black Muslim, if you're an immigrant from any of the countries that were sort of where the ban was in place, or where that have been called shithole countries, or all the different insults that we've been called over the years, right? But I think that folks from these areas really understand that they are deemed, their whole existence is deemed as suspicious, their bodies, their ways of being, their lives, their cultures. And that's really helpful information, albeit heartbreaking information, but something that I think we can really trust our own instincts and knowledge about. We fundamentally mistrust the government as a culture. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing, because I think it gives us a really important starting point. We're not trying to do the work of convincing ourselves that governments are untrustworthy, or that this government in particular in the United States is untrustworthy. We know it, we've experienced it. And lots of communities have, but I'm obviously just speaking to Muslims. In terms of trans bodies, I think a lot about my friend Ash Stevens, who writes about the surveillance of trans bodies and criminalization, and talks about this, the original sort of, that talks about families as being the original sites of surveillance when it comes to trans bodies. The watching of children, are they conforming to gender? Are they not conforming to gender? It kind of primes you for this idea of state surveillance later on, because your existence from its very inception has been questioned by the people that love you. And that's a really complicated dynamic when the people that love you harm you. That's always complicated. But I think it really kind of prepares you for the future mass surveillance that the state is talking about. And we surveil each other constantly around gender. Are you behaving appropriately in ways that we expect of you? And I don't even mean, I think there's so many layers of that. Like, is it like, is it around propriety, around tone, around anger, all these things that we really look at people and their behavior based to see whether it maps on to what we deem is appropriate for the sort of gender that we have assigned them. And so I think surveillance in gender is very common and very much a part of our culture. And then I think about repro justice and, the pieces that Vanessa and Shenaaz said in the intro, which is that this country is built on control of certain bodies, Black bodies, Indigenous bodies. And what that means is that, again, there's this state incentive to control reproduction, a state incentive to control bodies for different reasons at different times, but fundamentally it's to maintain its own white supremacist agenda. And that's a really dangerous thing, and not separate from what's happening right now in the repro movement and the attacks on repro. So self-managed abortion, which Mirna talked about a little bit, just so I define what it is someone taking their abortions into their own hands outside of a formal medical system. Now, this sounds really scary to people in this country because most people think like, yes, maybe controlling abortion is fucked up, but controlling self-managed abortion, should we really let people go ahead and do whatever they want with their bodies? Yes, absolutely. People have been having abortions since the beginning of fucking time. And your auntie that gives you the herbal potion for the abortion that works in your family is a self-managed abortion. Your family member in Mexico sending you the pill that's more easily accessible to them when you need an abortion is a self-managed abortion. And I think fundamentally the scary piece for people is the surveillance part. Are you really not going to let someone watch you while you do this thing? Are you really not going to involve a medical professional to control you? And the answer is, I won't, because, and I'm not saying people should have clinical abortions or self-manage their abortions based on what feels good to them. But when we know that the primary pathway for people getting reported to the criminal system, the criminal punishment system for having an abortion is the medical provider you turned to for medical support, then why wouldn't someone take their medical care into their own hands? And then you think a lot about trans people who have been failed historically by the medical system in this country, and so therefore don't trust their OBs, understandably, and so therefore self-managed abortion might be appealing to them. And so if you're thinking about who is likely to self-manage, we're thinking about folks that either don't have access or don't trust the access that they have, or they just feel safer doing it for those reasons or others, right? Again, Muslim communities probably more likely to self-manage their abortions when you already understand, especially if you're a Black Muslim immigrant, and you're like, the state has already deemed me suspicious. Medical providers are already surveilling me to make sure that I'm adequately taking care of myself during this pregnancy, which is a fucked up idea anyway. So maybe I don't trust the medical system because I'm not used to trusting the medical system. My community has valid, tangible information about how these systems report me and fail me. Then you do the thing that you think is safest for you. And then there's a culture which says, like, actually, if you take these decisions into your own hands, whether it's gender affirming surgery or taking abortion medication, that like you are suspicious because you don't want to be surveilled. And I think that's the scary part, is the culture of surveillance is so overarching. It's in the fabric of our lives, our families, our relationships. You get on the subway in New York, it's see something, say something, right? We have been told that we should report the people around us under the guise of safety. And the family regulation system is a really interesting entry point, because like, if you're a family defense attorney and then you've practiced in criminal court, they're both terrible spaces, and I'm not trying to say one is worse than the other or better than the other, but I'm always surprised how in family court, like even the like limited constitutional protections you have in criminal court don't mean shit. And they don't mean shit because the government is like, hey, you woman of color that I have deemed to be suspicious, that can't be trusted with their pregnancies, I'm going to watch you, and I'm going to make sure that, like, to keep the future children safe, as if they give a fuck about children, that under the guise of the safety of your children, I will demand that you do drug tests for no reason. I will demand that you do forced mandated treatment for things because I've just decided, right? It's these like, the same sort of limited rights that we have in other spaces don't exist there because they're under the guise of what has become acceptable to surveil. It is acceptable to surveil pregnant people at every stage of their pregnancy under the guise of prenatal care, which if we gave a shit about prenatal care and if we gave a shit about babies, things would look a lot different than just testing people and mandating appointments. They would look like giving people resources. But no, it's never been about that. And it's never going to be about that in a culture of surveillance, as long as we're watching each other. And then we look at all these abortion laws, right? Whether they're targeting pregnant people or they're targeting providers, fundamentally, they're trying to create a culture where there's literally a bounty in states like Texas if you think someone has had an abortion or has helped someone have an abortion. And so that auntie that gave you that like herbal potion that she knows works for the abortion in her family and has protected many generations of people having unwanted pregnancies and created a culture of actually safety, is now a helper. And there is a bounty over her head, right? And that's the scary thing, is that we are creating a culture where reporting people for making decisions about their own bodies is fundamentally something that they get to be deemed suspicious for. And it's fucking scary. And, you know, what's the answer? I don't know, but surveillance is not. I think probably surveillance is not, and building community is. Communities will keep people safe in these moments. And all these things are meant to sever our relationships with each other. I mean, Mirna talked about this. The very idea of putting an informant in your community is to make you mistrust each other. And so I think the answer is really not to be coy about being supportive of people making decisions around their own bodies. It's to be really fucking loud about it. You know, it's not, is this person worthy of having made this decision? Is this person not? No, the question is overall, are we okay with trusting a government that has committed genocide and controlled us historically with actually deciding what's best for our communities? No, we know best. We have the answers. And I think that's why I love doing Repro work in the Muslim space, is because like, I think people really understand mistrust from a very tangible place. Again, there's like a gazillion things I could say about all this, but we're at time. But thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Rafa. I mean, we go until another half an hour. And at this point, we're gonna open it up for discussion across the panelists. I also want to encourage our attendees to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature to submit any questions that you would like to ask of the panelists. I mean, there's so, yeah, you know, the piece around with the inception of like overseers and like deploying community to watch each other, and how that really, you know, its root is in the enslavement of Black folks, and determining some folks as more worthy as others, how that kind of builds on this whole logic of disposability. And, you know, thinking about like the panopticon and how that's linked to the incarceration. And I think about this a lot in terms of like with reproductive justice work in Muslim communities, you know, part of what we're also doing is we're trying to change the culture, right? So there's so many things that we're simultaneously confronting, right? It's like informing our communities of this like very complex web of systems that you all have really skillfully outlined for us. And then there's also the way that we kind of reproduce the impacts of the systems on each other, with policing each other, with whether it's policing gender, policing a sense of belonging, who is worthy as a Muslim, who represents Muslims. So I wonder what questions you have for each other. You know, I'm kind of, we could talk about the ways in which, you know, these systems, or if there are examples of ways that you think that we could be creating, you know, if the antidote is then communities that are connected, that show up for each other, how does that become something that we practice? I think that people talk about it, but like, what is the actual way that we cut through this kind of like nexus of being entrapped and really suppressed and flattened? How do we cut through that to create robust community, like change the culture, you know, change what does it mean to be Muslim, change how we show up for each other. So I wonder if there are responses from any of you around that question, or additional questions that you have of each other. And again, to the attendees, please feel free to use the chat to ask any questions as well.
I think, you know, Shenaaz, I think a lot about the work that you're doing at Queer Crescent as being some of the work that we should be doing. So as maybe the answer, and that's really nice that you do work that is actually maybe the answer. But specifically, you're talking about creating a fund around supporting people around bodily autonomy, supporting Muslims around bodily autonomy. And I think there's so many things that happen when you're bold about that vision. One of them is that the idea that Muslims care about their own bodily autonomy to sort of a mainstream liberal Democrat even is surprising, because they conceive of us as like, you know, backward ass, like, you know, ruled by patriarchal overlords with like oppressed women who can't make decisions about their own bodies, right? That's the public sort of description of being Muslim in this country. And I think that something about making those connections for people is really, really important to say in this panel with boldness, that like Muslims care about bodily autonomy is a really kind of bold statement. And I think that's really important, and being unapologetic about that. I also think creating connections for people, like, again, like we're doing here, between all these different systems that we sometimes see as disparate. So if it's, you know, the immigration system and the deportation system, it's not an accident that, as Vanessa mentioned, that abortion people who are, you know, support abortion are also being surveilled by DHS. There's a protest around abortion, and then the Department of Homeland Security is there. Why are they there? And I think unless you're making those connections for people, they seem like random accidents, but they're obviously not. And so constantly talking about those connections feels like one of the ways to me.
There we go. I think specifically within the context of counter-extremism in the United States, it's important to remember that the government really latches onto like the problems, the oppressions that it created in order to justify its expansion within communities. So for example, if we're thinking about, you know, nonprofit organizations, arts organizations that work with youth of color taking DHS funding, the fact that like these programs are needed, the fact that they cannot get funding anyway, that they are barred and like get kept out of all of this, that is a problem that the government created. Or if we think about access to mental health care, actually healthcare in general, because counter-extremism within all healthcare. So with that being said, I think when people think about anti-surveillance organizing, sometimes they get overwhelmed because they feel like the organizing that they do has to really specifically address surveillance. Like you have to oppose a facial recognition camera, and that's the only form of anti-surveillance organizing that can exist. But it's not. That's just one part of it. And so if you remember that surveillance and that the United States is going to latch on to these other problems it created, really any form of addressing those problems is in fact anti-surveillance. And so whether that is mutual aid funds, whether it's organizations like Muslims for Just Futures, you know, they're putting together their Muslim Workers Network, you know, supporting labor rights, supporting labor unions. I think all of that is really big, really vital. And again, I just think it's important to remember that the work we do to confront these systems can look so many different ways. It doesn't have to look like quote unquote boots on the ground organizing. If you write, if you're a graphic designer, if you have money to offer people, like all of that, all those skills, all those talents that you have are also really useful and really vital for movements.
It's been lovely to hear and learn actually from each other on the panel. And so I've learned a lot from people who have shared. And I think I kept thinking about what matters to me personally, Shenaaz, as like part of this work and how do we get there, is that we are not, at least this is my own personal opinion, is that I really think we're not talking enough about each other's privileges, and we're not really getting into the culture and habit of doing risk assessment of each other within a spaces. And that's something I'm also practicing and trying to do better, because, as someone who transitioned from being on a watch list to being a citizen, and, being not a lawyer and being a refugee to being a lawyer, as I transition through those privilege kind of scales, it's making me pause on how do we really get into the culture of assessing and taking responsibility and taking care of each other while we do that work. And that taps into the conversation of privilege, right? Privilege is not just race and money and etc. It is all of those things together, but also it is how are we impacted under surveillance? As within, us Muslims amongst each other, we are each targeted differently by surveillance. So how do we get into that culture of doing that religious? It's like wudu, before prayer, it's like, how do we practice our own safety wudu before, as we're doing this work, abolition, inshallah? Because I can say this now, but others should not be saying it. As someone who does this work, I really feel scared and actually frustrated when people are quote unquote radical leftists, etc., and rallying folks who could be vulnerable and targeted to do it. But then I want to backtrack and say this, and I've shared this with Shenaaz and Rafa and people who know me, is that how do we balance not freaking people out, because that's debilitating and that's their goal, to freak us out and hold our resistance, but at the same time hold each other accountable to our privileges, so the people who can be at the front line are there, but also utilizing our communal resources to get there. That probably does not make any sense. But I also wanted to share this resource. Thank you, Vanessa, by the way, for sharing these resources. That this is the CARP list that I was on, and that's why my immigration benefit got delayed by almost a decade, and not a lot of people know about it. And I thought I would share it here so people understand also how we are impacted on immigration level.
Thank you, Mirna. And I absolutely, it was completely making sense. And I think that how do we take these conversations to kind of a deeper level where we can actually be doing those self-assessments, supporting each other in, and understanding that kind of the target is moving, and how we also move through life and have different experiences that will make us more or less vulnerable at different times. That it's not static, because these technologies continue to evolve and adapt. And so therefore we need to collectively also be adapting and responding in coordination with each other. So I appreciate that point taken. And, I think that was part of the design of this workshop, or this panel rather, is to really inform our communities around this context. And that we continue to be present. Queer Crescent continues to be present for folks who want to reach out to us, who want to kind of connect and talk one-on-one after this panel around how this information then lands on you. What does it mean for your realities? And how can we kind of continue to support you with more direct one-on-one or smaller group safety kind of nets for each other? We have a couple of questions from the audience that I'd like to read. So the first is, hi, I've seen others talking a lot about how people can be tracked via period/menstruation apps, and the police using their information to prosecute people seeking out abortion care. Damn. Do you think this will become a reality in America when Roe falls? And to anyone who wants to take the lead on that.
I can do that. So, of course, others can also. The first, I guess, a couple of things. So there's a period app called Yuki that was created specifically to combat this idea that surveillance was going to be used around reproductive care based on people's menstruation apps. So the specific app, Yuki, you can find it EUKI, I believe, or EUKY, was built for this reason. That said, we don't really know, there has been no known instances of using specific period tracker apps to date in people's criminal prosecutions. But this idea of what will be a reality post-Roe and pre-Roe is complicated. So prosecution of people for their pregnancy outcomes has taken place since the existence of Roe, regardless of what happens in the Supreme Court case that we're about to see. And in those criminal prosecutions, prosecutors have done what they do in every case, which is that they illegally use the information from your phone, your text messages, anything that you have open on your phone, to look at, anything you bought online, your emails, receipts in your phone, all of the data that you have that they can find has been used for people in people's prosecutions. And so I don't think post-Roe will be the fall of Roe will be any different. I think we might see an increase in criminal prosecutions generally, which means that there will be more use of data on your phones, et cetera, for this purpose. And so there's a fund called the Digital Defense Fund, and I really recommend checking them out. They specifically talk about digital defense for abortion care, both, and I think that they have really great resources. But I think the reality in America right now is that people's data is used constantly to prosecute them.
I'm not sure, Rafa, if you finished your sentence. And in that is that I'm glad we're having this conversation, because it feels like we're like at the right kind of time of getting on it as queer Muslims, is that we do need to have funds that go more towards like bodily autonomy related things, specifically abortion. But also, as we do that, it's very important to do digital safety trainings and resources. And I think they go hand in hand. Like, we can no longer do that work without investing in our literacy in digital world and what it means to be safe and protecting each other on that front. Yeah, I really look forward to more of these conversations. And if people want, I've been independently doing lots of research and reading around this, and I would love to host circles of sharing knowledge in how we can keep each other safe and share. For example, like I finished law school and I didn't know until I had clients who got their email subpoenaed by Google and used by the JTCF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, to actually prosecute them, or at least terrify them and show up at their doors at 5 a.m. Because they have gotten these records, and that Google, for example, does not tell you that the government subpoenaed your records and asked for your records. Just if people are not familiar with the word subpoena, is that they tell you after the fact. So after it's too late, after the damage is done, they tell you, oh, the government asked for your records and we gave them the records. And they don't tell you what records, what emails, etc. So how can you actually defend yourself if you don't know what records have been handed over to these people? And I feel like we need a lot more conversations and maybe formal know your rights regarding how to stay safe and keep each other safe in the digital world as we protect each other on other fronts.
Yeah, I also think about like how this feels connected to the ways in which like people get kind of tried in the public sphere, and so there's like this warmongering and the pervasive kind of like targeting of people and the way that that's connected to media, the lack of media justice, Vanessa, that you were talking about. And I was listening to our colleagues, our comrades at Translash Media's podcast, and Imara Jones's show, and she was just covering how there's all these like, it's all linked in terms of who's funding. The Heritage Foundation is funding all this like anti-trans legislation and policy, and then media. And so there's all these kind of like back channels of white supremacist kind of incel channels. And soon after the Uvalde massacre, one of these, I think it's called 4chan, there was some posting saying that the shooter was trans, and that got then picked up, and it kind of entered the mainstream media cycles. And how it then kind of became this like reproduction of like, see, this is why we need anti-trans laws. This is how, and how that moving target of, in this case, trans, it was not even the case, but this like creation, this narrative that this is the person to blame, this is the group to blame, and this is why we need policies of so-called protection against these groups. And how that's also an experience that as Muslim people we can relate to. And so I think about like both the literacy and the knowledge sharing in our communities, and also how we have to work to really show up and like widen again who we're counting, who we're talking about. I think this is where, Rafa, I really have to appreciate, getting to work and work with you and understand the way that you enter reproductive justice, and seeing how bodily autonomy and the attacks on trans folks is the same mechanism, that's being deployed to limit people's access to abortions. And, how that is also connected to like so-called Sharia laws and attacks on Muslim communities. Like these are all the same kind of like apparatus and mechanisms that are being used to deploy. And I think our work as organizers is to demonstrate that we inhabit all these identities. We are trans, we are Muslim, we get abortions. Like those all happen in the same body or bodies as a community. And that we are kind of shoulder to shoulder, we're stronger when we kind of can really see each other in this shared struggle. We have another question, and this is kind of maybe a good place for us to kind of move towards a close on. What is one thing currently happening that is giving you hope about the movement towards abolition, inshallah, in surveillance work?
I guess I can answer, is that these conversations are giving me hope. Like no matter how rough our conversations are or imperfect they are or not fully formed, like the fact that we are having them, I think is what's driving me. And it's really humbling, but at the same time driving me with lots of like energy into furthering my commitment into this. So that's really giving me hope. And I think it's important for us to remember that we should be comfortable with the imperfection of where we are at and where we are heading. Because if we had figured it out, like Palestine will be free, Black folks would be as they should, like the leaders of the world. Like if we had figured out how to actually liberate and move towards liberation, collective liberation, I don't think we would be having this conversation. So like, as someone who also struggles with this, is like, I always think things have to be perfect, or things have to be a certain way or look a certain way or sound a certain way. But I think we encourage each other by just showing up and with intentions and kind of duty to each other in our imperfections, and we kind of lean on each other to get there. And that's really giving me hope. So I'm grateful to have been given that. Thank you for all of you to have made that happen for me personally.
Lately I've just been paying attention to like community-led reports, and just how important and like how vital I think they are So I referenced CJE's report on data criminalization, which again, I think can really help people reconceptualize how they're approaching surveillance as a concept. But I also spoke, or I did an article on the People's Review of Prevent, which is the United Kingdom's counter-extremism program. And I just think that these types of reports and like this type of like archiving is really vital and something that I really want to see more of, and it's giving me hope about the movement overall. Because if you're unable to, you know, reconceptualize these systems, these programs for yourself, if the only reports we have to draw from are the ones that are endorsed by the state, created by the state, and et cetera, then our movements are going to stall, because you can only go so far when you're working within like the state's own context. And so when I see different reports, when I see new organizations, when I see new people get into like journalism and media, as somebody who's really concerned with like narrative production, that gives me a lot of hope.
Calls to defund the police have been really, really hopeful. I think that it's been really nice to see people not, it's so fucking weird to say it's nice, because like obviously horrible trauma leads communities to these conclusions. And anyway, so with that caveat, right, it is also really heartening to hear people talking about the police as not being able to keep us safe, because that has never been the goal of the police, right? We're not to move away from this idea of like, oh, this is shocking because we thought police officers were good, to, and I know that many people and many communities, and specifically Black communities and certain migrant communities, et cetera, have known this for a long time. But I think there is something really heartening about that entering a more mainstream conversation, that their goal is not to keep us safe. It is not surprising that they kill who they kill. It is not surprising that they don't protect when that is allegedly their job. That's just never been their job in the first place. And so I think once we know that, it creates space to actually build solutions and responses, versus trying to shift an institution that is inherently unshiftable, because that was never what it was meant for. And then I really love the Repro Legal Defense Fund, y'all. I work there. I'm the director of the project, so I know this is like a little bit of a bias, but truly it is really, really incredible to see the amount of people that are ready to mobilize resources to get pregnant people free. I think that people have not seen pregnant people as targets of state surveillance and criminalization for a very long time, even though they have been. And it is also heartening to see how much people are willing to throw down to get folks out of jail, how much people are willing to see those connections, feels important. And I think obviously panels like this, like Mirna said, contribute to that.
To that end, I want to invite folks who are here today, if you would like to learn more about these issues that were raised, and really kind of gain learn with us a deeper understanding of reproductive and gender justice. We're partnering with Heart this coming Thursday for a workshop on Muslims and bodily autonomy. So please join us. I just dropped the registration link in the chat. It's the same time as this workshop, or this panel, and it'll be a workshop, more interactive. We'd love to have you. Heart has been a wonderful partner for us for the last several months as we're growing our reproductive justice work, and Heart has been doing RJ work in Muslim communities for a very long time. And so definitely want to point folks to their website, and they have tons of resources really looking at reproductive healthcare, reproductive access from very Islamic perspective. And so if that is your jam, or if those are the questions that you have, you can certainly find a wealth of resources with Heart. Any questions for each other? I realized I said that we were going to do that, and then I didn't really do that. So any questions that you have for each other before we say goodbye?
Not a question, but Vanessa, I hope I connect with you and that we build around our work.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'm going to make it a point to connect with both of y'all very soon.
Awesome. Oh, we lost Mirna, lost sound. Okay, well, we're just about to wrap up. Maybe somebody can chat that. I thank you to the panelists. Thank you so much for being here, for sharing with us, for really kind of seeding what I hope to be as a continual kind of community conversation around how we can be building more communities of care and safety with one another. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for, again, to Delia and Amara on the back end, all the QC staff who helped make this event happen. Much love and appreciation. Please reach out if there are ongoing questions or needs that you have, or ways that we can support you in community. Feel free to reach out on our website or on our social media. So with that, we'll say toodles. Bye, everybody.